December 24th, 1944. Camp Concordia, Kansas. Snow swept across the barbed wire fences in thin, ghostly veils. The night sky hung low, bruised by winter clouds, and the wind carried with it a silence that felt too heavy for a world still at war. Inside the American prisoner of war compound, rows of wooden barracks stood dark and still, until somewhere in the cold, a faint voice began to sing. It was soft at first, then another joined in, and another. Within moments, the frozen camp echoed with the sound of Stille Nacht. German voices, hundreds of them, rising together in harmony, under the guarded watch of American soldiers who didn't reach for their rifles, but listened. This was not how a war was supposed to sound. The German prisoners. It felt almost unreal. Just days before their capture, some had fought in the Ardennes, watching friends die beneath shattered trees and frozen soil. Others had been airmen, shot down over France or the North Sea, dragged from burning wreckage into enemy hands. Now they stood under the dim glow of floodlights, the enemy allowing them to sing. Their carols, their words. No one stopped them. No one shouted. For a few moments, the war outside those wire fences seemed to fall away. The guards, mostly young Americans, barely older than the prisoners they watched, shifted uneasily at first. Many had brothers fighting overseas or had lost friends to German shells. But as the singing grew, something in that haunting melody reached them. It was Christmas Eve, and in that moment, both sides felt the same chill of homesickness, the same ache for warmth and peace. Across the Atlantic, Europe was burning. The Battle of the Bulge was raging in Belgium, the last great German offensive in the West. Hitler's panzers had punched deep into the Ardennes, catching the Allies off guard. Snow-cloaked forests echoed with tank engines, artillery, and the screams of retreating soldiers. American towns were bombed, convoys destroyed, and the sky itself had become a battlefield of smoke and flame. But here, in the middle of Kansas, 5,000 miles away, the war seemed suspended in a strange pocket of humanity. Camp Concordia wasn't small. It was one of more than 500 POW camps scattered across the United States, built to house the tide of captured Axis soldiers flooding in from North Africa and Europe. By late 1944, over 400,000 German prisoners lived on American soil. The U.S. War Department had expected trouble, riots, escapes, sabotage. What they got instead was something entirely different: order, industry, and surprising civility. The camp's architecture was precise, almost military in its symmetry. Barracks built from pine and tar paper-lined gravel roads. Guard towers loomed at each corner, their searchlights sweeping the snow. Yet inside the wire, German prisoners lived lives that would have shocked their comrades still fighting overseas. They were fed 3 times a day. They received pay for work. They played soccer, attended church, and even published newsletters. The Geneva Convention, so often ignored in Europe, was upheld here with near-clinical discipline that many prisoners. It was disorienting. They had been raised on a diet of Nazi propaganda. Americans were decadent, brutal, and subhuman. Yet here, they found order without cruelty, guards who smiled, and officers who enforced fairness even against their own men. When Christmas approached, camp commandants across the U.S. faced a question no manual had prepared them for. Should they let German prisoners celebrate? At Concordia, the answer came quietly. The commandant, a veteran of the Pacific Theater, reportedly said, "If we can keep peace on Christmas Eve, maybe we can keep it the rest of the year." So he gave permission. The Germans could hold a Christmas service. The decision spread through the camp like a spark. Within hours, the German chaplain began organizing the event. Prison carpenters built a makeshift altar from scrap lumber. Others crafted candles from melted margarine and thread. The camp orchestra, an odd assembly of captured musicians, tuned their instruments under the watchful eyes of American guards who could only shake their heads in disbelief. When night fell, the prisoners gathered outside, faces lit by flickering flames and pale moonlight. They sang with the force of men who had seen too much death, whose hearts clung to something that war could not destroy. The guards stood silently by. One of them, a sergeant from Iowa, was later heard saying that for the first time since Pearl Harbor, he felt that the war might actually end someday. But not everyone was comfortable with this sudden warmth. Beyond the camp fences, townsfolk whispered. Rumors spread through local diners and church pews. The Germans are singing their carols, they said. They're celebrating like they're home. Some were outraged. To them, the men behind the wire were still killers, responsible for dead sons and husbands overseas. How could they be allowed to celebrate anything? Still, the Commandant stood firm. He understood something deeper, something the war itself was beginning to reveal. America's power was not just in its machines or its armies, but in its principles. By treating prisoners with dignity, the U.S. was showing the world that democracy wasn't just an idea shouted from podiums. It was a way of acting, even toward one's enemies. For the Germans, that night planted seeds of confusion and reflection. Many had been taught that surrender meant humiliation, that capture by Americans meant torture or starvation. Instead, they found discipline, decency, and even compassion. For the first time, they began to question what they had fought for. Some would later admit that the first doubts about Hitler's cause began not in battle, but in an American prison camp. During a song sung under foreign stars, the final verse of Silent Night faded. The cold wind swept across the compound again. The prisoners bowed their heads. Some wept. A few of the guards joined softly, their English words mixing with German syllables until the two languages became indistinguishable. When the service ended, the Commandant ordered something unprecedented: extra rations for all, American and German alike. That night, both sides ate together in peace, if not in company. The war raged on in Europe, but for a few precious hours, Camp Concordia became an island of quiet defiance against hatred itself. And yet, under the warmth of that temporary truce, another truth lingered. The Americans' decision to allow the celebration was more than mercy, it was psychological strategy. Whether by design or instinct, they were waging a different kind of battle, one for hearts and minds. A campaign not fought with bullets, but with decency. The German officers noticed it too. Some recorded their astonishment in letters later intercepted by U.S. censors. "They treat us not as animals," one wrote, "but as men. I do not understand it." The words spread like wildfire among the prisoners. Something was changing behind those fences. By midnight, the camp lights dimmed, and the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ground in silence once more. Beyond the fences, the wind carried the faint echo of carols into the Kansas night. But deep inside the barracks, German soldiers lay awake, haunted not by fear, but by a question that would grow louder with each passing day. Why had their enemies shown them mercy, when their own leaders had taught them none? The answer to that question, how the United States used compassion as a weapon more powerful than any rifle, would reveal itself in the months to come. The morning after Christmas dawned pale and silent. Frost coated the barbed wire in delicate crystals, and the Kansas sky burned orange over Camp Concordia. The Germans awoke to the sound of the bugle, just like every other day, but something felt changed. The memory of the night before lingered, as if the camp itself had drawn a deep breath and exhaled humanity. Yet behind this gesture of kindness lay something deliberate. The Americans were not only guarding prisoners, they were conducting a vast experiment in psychological warfare. By 1944, the United States War Department had developed a strategy for managing the hundreds of thousands of German POWs now living on American soil. It was called reorientation. The idea was simple: show the prisoners what America stood for, not through lectures or propaganda, but through daily life, discipline, fairness, opportunity. The goal was to plant doubt in the ideology they had fought for. At the heart of that strategy were men like Colonel Clifford Singleton, a military psychologist attached to the Provost Marshal General's office. Singleton believed that respect breeds reflection. His reports argued that a German prisoner treated with decency would question his indoctrination far more deeply than one beaten or starved. The Geneva Convention, therefore, became not just a legal code, it became a weapon of influence. Inside Camp Concordia, this philosophy manifested in 1,000 small details. Prisoners were allowed to organize orchestras, theater troupes, and even academic lectures. Some studied English. Others built furniture or repaired farm machinery. In many camps, the Americans supplied tools and materials so prisoners could work alongside local civilians in agriculture, under supervision, but with a wage. Their pay came in canteen coupons, used to buy cigarettes or sweets. It was a strange sort of captivity, one that looked, from a distance, Almost like rehabilitation, the Germans were astonished. "We expected hate," wrote one POW, "but found fairness." These letters, translated by U.S. Army censors, became data points in an invisible campaign. The American command wanted the men returning to Germany to carry those memories home, to compare them against the brutality of the Reich and the destruction it had unleashed. Behind this approach stood the architects of America's wartime logistics machine: psychologists, educators, engineers, and clerks, all working in quiet offices from Washington to Fort Sam Houston. They saw the POW camps as laboratories of post-war reconstruction. Treating the prisoners humanely wasn't weakness. It was planning. Still, kindness alone would not sustain the system. The logistical backbone of the POW program was staggering. Each prisoner required food, shelter, clothing, medical care, and security. By late 1944, with over 400,000 Germans in custody, that meant entire rail networks hauling supplies inland. Refrigerated boxcars carried meat and produce from the coasts. Army quartermaster depots managed warehouses stocked with blankets, uniforms, and soap. Factories like the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant in Michigan didn't just produce tanks. They also made stoves, cots, and water heaters for the camps. Every object was cataloged, every shipment logged. American efficiency had turned captivity into an industrial operation. The same systems that fueled the front lines in Europe now maintained prisoners halfway across the world. The German prisoners noticed. Many were engineers, mechanics, or tradesmen by profession. They marveled at how smoothly the system ran. Food arrived on time. Tools were repaired. Even the camp's power grid seldom failed. "Their organization is frightening," one Luftwaffe pilot noted. "We could not imagine this level of abundance." It wasn't just organization, it was philosophy. The Americans believed morale was the foundation of victory, even among captives. Every POW camp operated under a fair treatment directive. Beatings were forbidden. Rations were calibrated by the U.S. Surgeon General to ensure nutritional parity with American troops. The logic was cold, even mathematical: a well-fed, occupied prisoner was easier to manage and more likely to reconsider his loyalties to Camp Concordia. German non-commissioned officers were given responsibilities within the compound. They supervised labor details, distributed supplies, and enforced internal discipline. It gave them a sense of purpose while reducing the burden on American guards. But it also served another purpose. By mirroring military hierarchy within humane boundaries, the Americans were subtly teaching a new kind of leadership, structured but restrained. The results became visible that winter. When a blizzard struck Kansas in early January 1945, snowdrifts buried roads and cut off power lines. Temperatures plummeted below zero. The camp's generators sputtered. Instead of panic, the Germans volunteered to repair the systems. Former Wehrmacht electricians and engineers formed work crews, clearing snow and restoring circuits side by side with their American captors. Within hours, lights flickered back to life across the compound. Something remarkable had happened. The line between prisoner and guard had softened, not in authority, but in understanding. The Americans had extended dignity. The Germans had answered with discipline. Both recognized something familiar in the other: professionalism. And yet, beneath this fragile camaraderie, the scars of war remained. Every man inside that wire had lost someone. Some still dreamed of returning to the Reich. Others had seen enough to abandon it. But all of them began to understand that their captors were not monsters. They were engineers, farmers, and mechanics, just like them. Letters intercepted by U.S. censors became windows into that realization. One prisoner wrote, "Here, the guards joke with us. They follow rules. I begin to think our leaders lied to us." Another, "If we had treated Russians as they treat us, perhaps our war would have been shorter." The American analysts who read those words recognized their quiet power. Each line was a bullet against Nazism, fired without a gun. The system was not flawless. There were camps where tempers flared, where violence broke out, and where ideology still poisoned the air. Hardcore Nazis sometimes tried to intimidate fellow prisoners who showed sympathy toward Americans. In a few compounds, secret courts formed, and collaborators were beaten, or worse. But those incidents were rare, and the American command responded with precision, identifying ringleaders, transferring them to isolated compounds, and reinforcing educational programs for the rest. By early 1945, reorientation had become an unofficial front in the war effort. At Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, a group of POWs, mostly former journalists and academics, was selected for a new experiment. Under U.S. Army supervision, they produced a newspaper called Der Ruf, The Call. Its pages carried essays on democracy, freedom, and rebuilding Europe. It was, in effect, America's ideological Trojan horse, written by Germans for Germans. The program's success owed much to the quiet coordination of America's industrial and academic minds. Psychologists from the University of Chicago advised on curriculum. The Office of War Information supplied translated articles. Even private companies contributed educational materials, believing it would help shape post-war markets. For the prisoners at Camp Concordia, these high-level strategies translated into something simple: dignity. They could work, learn, and hope. When word of Germany's collapse finally reached them months later, many didn't cheer or despair. They simply sat in silence, processing what they had already begun to suspect. And yet, the most profound transformation was not ideological. It was human. On the day after Christmas, one American guard wrote in his journal, "They sang for their dead. We listened for hours. For one night, maybe we were all on the same side." But this experiment in compassion was far from over. Its consequences would reach beyond the fences of Kansas, shaping how nations treated the defeated and how soldiers rebuilt peace. Because soon, as Germany lay in ruins, these same prisoners would return home carrying the memory of how their enemies had treated them. And in that return lay the true victory. The Americans never fired a shot to win. Spring 1945. The war in Europe was ending. Across the Atlantic, the ruins of Berlin smoked under a gray sky, and Hitler's empire crumbled into dust. But in the heart of America, behind fences now quiet with anticipation, thousands of German prisoners waited for orders that would decide their fate. The war had ended, but the battle for their beliefs had only just begun at Camp Concordia. The news came over the radio on May 8th. Germany has surrendered unconditionally. For a long moment, the camp stood frozen. Then came the murmur, subdued, uncertain. Some prisoners cheered. Others turned away in silence. A few wept openly, their faces caught between shame and relief. Their world, the Reich they had once fought for, no longer existed. Yet here, among the fields of Kansas, they had already glimpsed another world, one that treated them not as enemies, but as men. The Americans, too, felt the shift. The guards who had watched over their captives for years knew that soon, these men would be gone. Some felt pride. Others, strangely, felt loss. They had shared work, jokes, and even music across the invisible lines of language and war. What had begun as duty had turned into understanding. But the story of the German POWs in America did not end with peace. It became something far more significant, a lesson in reconstruction, humanity, and the power of moral example. After Germany's surrender, U.S. military intelligence launched Operation Paperclip, a secret program to bring selected German scientists and engineers to America. Men like Wernher von Braun, whose V-2 rockets had once terrorized London, would soon design the rockets that carried Americans into space. It was a controversial act, born not of forgiveness, but of pragmatism. Yet it showed how war had transformed enemies into instruments of progress. The same principle that guided the humane treatment of POWs, use knowledge, not vengeance, was now shaping the future itself. For the rest of the German prisoners, repatriation came slowly. The Geneva Convention required their return as soon as practicable, but the United States faced a dilemma. Europe lay in ruins. There were no homes to return to, no factories left standing. Many POWs were quietly transferred to Britain or France to help rebuild. Others remained in America, working farms or repairing roads until 1946. Each man carried with him stories that would ripple through post-war Germany. One of them was Franz Müller, a former Wehrmacht sergeant from Cologne. He had spent 3 years in Kansas, working on a wheat farm under the watch of an American foreman named Bill Harding. When Müller finally boarded the train for New York, Harding handed him a small Bible and a photograph of the two men standing beside a tractor. Years later, Muller would tell his children that he learned the meaning of freedom not in Germany, but in captivity, because his enemy had shown him mercy. Such stories multiplied. Former POWs wrote letters, gave interviews, and even published memoirs describing their experiences. They spoke of American guards who shared cigarettes, of local families who waved at them from passing cars, and of the Christmas night when they sang their carols under enemy stars. These accounts became powerful symbols in post-war Europe. They suggested that democracy was not merely a system, it was a spirit, one that could survive even in war. American analysts quickly understood the value of this narrative. Reports compiled by the War Department concluded that humane treatment of POWs had fostered goodwill that could aid occupation efforts. It was, in a sense, psychological groundwork for the Marshall Plan, a foundation of trust between victor and vanquished. The U.S. had not only defeated Germany's armies, it had begun to reshape German minds. But the transformation went deeper still. Many of those who had been held in American camps later became voices of moderation in post-war Germany. Some entered politics, others education or engineering. A number of them contributed to the rebuilding of West Germany's democracy. They carried with them lessons learned in captivity, that authority could coexist with fairness, that discipline did not require cruelty, and that a nation's strength was measured not by fear, but by justice. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the camps began to vanish. Barracks were dismantled, barbed wire rolled away, and guard towers torn down. But traces of what had happened there lingered, in the soil, in the memories of the towns that had hosted their former enemies. Some locals remembered the Germans as polite workers who helped harvest wheat or mend barns. Others remembered them as a strange, fleeting presence, ghosts of a distant war who had come to Kansas and then disappeared. And yet, every Christmas, in a few of those small towns, a curious tradition continued. Local choirs sang Silent Night, in both English and German, a quiet tribute to the night when the enemy had been allowed to sing their OWN in the decades that followed. Historians began to see these POW camps as more than footnotes. They were, in their own way, battlefields of a different kind, where the weapons were ideals, and the victory was measured not in territory, but in conscience. Military strategists studying the Cold War later cited the American POW program as an early example of hearts and minds warfare. In Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, the principle reappeared, the idea that the treatment of prisoners could shape political outcomes as much as combat victories. In modern war, wrote one Pentagon analyst in 1967, every action is a broadcast. The humane handling of the defeated became part of America's global image, a demonstration of moral power, but that power had come at a cost. Many Americans who lost family in Europe or the Pacific had never forgiven the enemy. For them, the sight of smiling German prisoners celebrating Christmas while their own sons lay in unmarked graves felt unbearable. The moral experiment had divided opinion even as it healed wounds, and yet, history would vindicate it. Because those same prisoners, once returned to Europe, became living proof that mercy could triumph where hatred had failed. Their testimonies softened post-war tensions, aided reconciliation, and offered a model for how the victors of the 20th century might avoid repeating the mistakes of the last the late 1950s. Some of the former guards and prisoners reunited, letters exchanged, visits made, friendships renewed. One American veteran, asked why he had allowed the Germans to celebrate Christmas in 1944, simply said, "Because I wanted them to remember who we were when the war was over." That sentiment became the quiet epilogue to the story. The battlefields of Europe had proven the might of American industry and arms. But in the camps of Kansas, America had proven something rarer, that strength and mercy could exist in the same hand. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, a German journalist interviewed several elderly men who had once been POWs in the United States. One of them, his voice trembling, said, "I did not cheer when the wall came down. I cried, because I remembered the night we sang in Kansas. That was when I first knew freedom was real." In the end, the Christmas truce at Camp Concordia was not a story of forgiveness alone. It was a revelation, a glimpse of what humanity could be, even in war's darkest winter. The American guards who stood in silence that night had no way of knowing they were witnessing history's quietest victory. And so the lesson endures, as enduring as that song itself, that even in a world of iron and fire, the heart remains the last battlefield, and mercy, when shown to the defeated, can outlive every empire. Still Nacht. Nacht. The words echo still.